Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Tonight's episode takes you on a holiday drive you were never meant to finish, down quiet American roads, where snow erases directions, lights appear without reason, and the journey itself starts paying attention. Now, let's begin. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over American highways after midnight in December, a quiet so complete it feels manufactured, as if the road has been cleared not just of cars but of witnesses. I learned to recognize that stillness the year my marriage ended and the holidays arrived without ceremony, the decorations going up around me while my own life felt paused between chapters. My name is Daniel. I was 34 that winter, newly relocated to a smaller city in the Midwest for a job that promised distance from everything I had just lost. I told myself the drive south would be good for me, a long stretch of road to let the noise in my head burn off, a cheap motel booked halfway to break the trip into manageable pieces. I left later than planned, the kind of delay that feels insignificant until the light drains out of the sky and the weather remembers you're traveling. The interstate thinned quickly once the evening commuters peeled away, their taillights disappearing toward exits marked with glowing green signs and familiar town names. Snow flurried lightly at first, just enough to soften the world without obscuring it, the flakes melting as soon as they touched the windshield. The radio held a steady signal for a while, then began to thin, voices warping into static that rose and fell without pattern. I didn't turn it off. Silence felt heavier than noise that night. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped sharply, and the snow grew thicker, the flakes larger and slower, drifting across the lanes in lazy arcs that erased the painted lines almost as soon as they appeared. I slowed instinctively, hands tightening on the wheel, aware of how alone the road had become. The storm intensified without warning. One moment visibility stretched comfortably ahead, and the next it collapsed inward, shrinking the world to the narrow reach of my headlights. Road signs emerged too late to read clearly, their reflective surfaces dulled by ice. The shoulders vanished beneath drifting snow, leaving no safe place to pull over. When my GPS lagged, then froze, I felt a dull knot form in my chest. The screen stayed locked mid-update for several seconds before the signal dropped entirely, the map dissolving into a blank grid. I told myself it would come back, that reception always faltered in bad weather, but the loss of that small certainty made the darkness beyond the windshield feel closer, heavier. I noticed the exit by accident. A battered sign surfaced through the snowfall just in time for me to register it, the lettering partially obscured but legible enough to catch one word that mattered: rest. I assumed it marked a rest area or services, something ordinary and safe, and took the ramp without fully thinking it through. The curve pulled me away from the interstate, and the sound of passing traffic faded quickly, replaced by a deep, pressing quiet. Snow coated the access road evenly, undisturbed by other vehicles, and the storm softened as I drove, the wind dying down until the flakes fell almost soundlessly, drifting rather than striking the ground. The road stretched longer than expected, bordered by low trees and dark embankments that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. My headlights felt inadequate here, the darkness ahead resisting illumination. After several minutes, I saw a glow through the snowfall, faint at first, then steadier as I approached. A low building emerged from the white, set back from the road beneath buzzing yellow lights. A neon sign flickered above it, the red letters smeared by falling snow until they were difficult to read. I pulled into the lot slowly and stopped beneath one of the lights, the engine idling louder than it should have in the stillness. The sign resolved itself as I stepped out of the car: Evergreen Rest Motel. The parking lot was empty. No cars sat beneath the lights, no fresh tracks marked the snow except the ones I just made. The motel itself looked older than I expected, a long single-story building with doors opening directly onto the lot, the kind designed for an era when highways were smaller and travelers fewer. Several room lights glowed warmly behind fogged windows, and the vacancy sign hummed steadily despite the storm. The contrast unsettled me. Places like this usually carried some trace of activity, even late at night, but the stillness here felt staged, as if the motel existed in isolation from the rest of the world. Inside, the lobby was warmer than anticipated, the air thick with the smell of old carpet and faintly burned coffee. A desk lamp cast a soft glow over the counter, illuminating a ledger open to a page filled with careful handwriting. No one stood behind the desk. I waited, stamping snow from my boots, listening to the hum of unseen heaters. When no one appeared, I cleared my throat and called out. My voice sounded louder than it should have in the small space. After a moment, a man stepped out from a back room, his movements unhurried, his expression neutral in a way that made it difficult to place his age. He greeted me without surprise, as though my arrival had been expected. He didn't ask for identification or payment details, only my name, which he wrote carefully into the ledger before handing me a key attached to a plastic tag marked with the number 12. His eyes lingered on me a fraction longer than necessary, not curious, not suspicious, just attentive in a way that tightened something in my chest. When I asked about food or nearby services, he shook his head gently and said the storm had closed most things down for the night, his voice calm and practiced, like a line repeated many times before. Room 12 sat near the far end of the building, its door indistinguishable from the others except for the small plastic number screwed into the peeling paint. The walkway outside was oddly dry, the concrete free of snow despite the storm still falling beyond the motel's lights. I noticed that detail immediately, though I told myself it was the heat from the building doing its work. Inside, the room was warmer than expected, the heater already running with a low, steady hum that felt less mechanical and more deliberate, like a held breath. The bed was made tightly, corners tucked with care, the blanket smoothed flat as though no one had touched it since it was last arranged. A single lamp glowed on the nightstand, casting soft shadows that didn't quite match the objects around them. I set my bag down and checked the window first, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out into the lot. My car sat alone beneath the yellow light, its dark shape half buried in snow. Beyond it, the lot stretched empty and undisturbed, the snow smooth except for my own tire tracks. There were no other vehicles, no sign that anyone else had arrived recently, yet several rooms along the building showed warm light behind fogged glass. The effect made it feel less like a motel full of guests and more like a display meant to suggest occupancy. I let the curtain fall back into place and tried to ignore the tightness creeping into my shoulders. The room smelled faintly metallic beneath the usual motel sense of detergent and stale air, a cold edge to the warmth that made my throat itch when I breathed too deeply. I unpacked slowly, more out of habit than need, listening to the quiet tick of the heater cycling on and off. At some point I realized I hadn't heard a single sound from neighboring rooms, no muffled television noise, no footsteps, no doors opening or closing. The silence felt complete, sealed, as if the building absorbed sound the way snow absorbs impact. I told myself it was late, that most people were asleep, but the explanation didn't sit right. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay on the bed fully clothed at first, staring at the ceiling as the lamp cast a dull yellow glow upward. The storm outside softened, the wind dying down until the snow fell gently, almost politely. Somewhere in the building, pipes shifted with a faint creak, then went quiet again. Just as I began to drift, a sound pulled me back to full awareness, footsteps outside, slow and measured, moving along the walkway. They passed my door, continued a few feet, then stopped. I held my breath, listening. No knock followed, no handle turned. After several seconds, the footsteps resumed, continuing down the walkway at the same unhurried pace. I told myself it was another guest, maybe the man from the desk doing rounds, though the thought didn't comfort me. The pattern repeated not long after. Footsteps approached, slowed, stopped outside my door, lingered just long enough to feel intentional, then moved on. Each pass lasted a little longer than the last. When I finally sat up and looked through the peephole, the walkway was empty, the concrete smooth and clean, untouched by snow or footprints. The absence unsettled me more than the sound itself. I stepped back, the room feeling smaller, the air thicker. Sometime later, tapping began at the window. Not loud enough to startle, not sharp enough to demand attention, just a soft contact against the glass. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. The rhythm was steady, patient, almost careful. I stood slowly, every muscle tense, and approached the window without pulling the curtain aside. Fog had begun to form on the glass, spreading outward in uneven streaks that dragged downward like the marks left by fingers unsure of their shape. The sight rooted me in place. When I lifted my hand toward the glass, the fog thinned and vanished instantly, leaving the window clear and reflective. Outside, there was nothing but falling snow and the empty lot. The heater clicked off without warning. The sudden absence of its hum made the room feel hollow. I checked the thermostat, pressing the buttons until the display flickered, then went dark entirely. My phone showed no signal, the screen dimming faster than it should have. I sat back on the bed, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself this was exhaustion, stress, the mind filling in gaps when routine fell away. The tapping did not return, but the sense of being observed did not fade. It shifted, concentrated, as though whatever lingered outside had learned enough to wait. Near morning, the footsteps returned one last time, slower now, heavier. They stopped outside my door and did not move on. The silence stretched until it pressed against my ears. I considered opening the door, calling out, doing anything to break the tension, but the thought of seeing someone, or something, standing there felt worse than enduring the waiting. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, moving away toward the far end of the building. I did not sleep again. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no gradual lightening of the sky, no soft transition from night to dawn, only the sudden realization that the darkness beyond the curtains had thinned into a dull gray. I sat up slowly, muscles stiff, my body feeling like it had remained braced all night even without sleep. The heater was running again, its low hum steady and unobtrusive, as though it had never shut off. For a moment, the room looked ordinary in the flat morning light, the bed neatly made except where I had disturbed it, the lamp still on, my bag resting by the chair. If not for the weight in my chest, I might have believed the night had been nothing more than anxiety amplified by weather. I pulled the curtain aside and looked out at the parking lot. The storm had ended completely. Snow lay smooth and undisturbed, a clean white sheet stretching from the building to the edge of the road. My car sat exactly where I had left it, the windshield dusted lightly, the mirrors folded in by the cold. What caught my attention were the marks near the walkway. Faint depressions pressed into the snow, shallow but deliberate, forming a loose path that ran the length of the building before curving around the far corner. They were spaced too far apart to belong to a person walking at a normal pace, and yet too consistent to be random. The path circled the motel once, then faded into nothing near the tree line. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The impressions didn't lead to any door. They didn't approach the windows. They simply traced the perimeter, like something pacing without destination. A sudden urge to leave took hold of me, sharp and undeniable. I packed quickly, shoving clothes into my bag without folding them, my movements efficient but rushed. I checked the bathroom, the closet, anywhere someone could have been hiding, though the idea felt absurd in the daylight. The room was empty, silent, unchanged. When I stepped outside, the cold bit deeper than expected, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs. The walkway was still dry, the concrete free of snow despite the accumulation everywhere else. I followed it toward the lobby, my footsteps the only sound. Inside, the desk area was dark. The lamp that had illuminated the ledger the night before was off, the counter bare and clean. There was no sign of the man who had checked me in, no ledger, no coffee pot warming on the side table. The lobby felt abandoned, like a space that had been reset rather than closed for the night. Called out once, my voice echoing slightly this time, but there was no response. The back room door stood ajar, revealing nothing but stacked boxes and a darkened hallway beyond. The air inside the lobby felt colder than it should have, carrying the same faint metallic edge I'd noticed in the room. I didn't wait for an explanation. I dropped the key on the counter, though I doubted anyone would see it, and walked back outside. The drive out of the lot felt surreal. As I turned toward the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of the motel stretching behind me, its lights still on, the vacancy sign glowing steadily despite the absence of any visible staff or guests. The building looked flatter in daylight, less substantial, like a stage set viewed from the wrong angle. When I reached the road and merged back onto the highway, the sense of pressure eased slightly, though it didn't disappear. Several miles passed before I realized something was wrong. The exit sign I had taken the night before was gone. I slowed, scanning both sides of the road, but there was no ramp, no faded sign, no indication that Evergreen Rest Motel had ever existed there. I checked my GPS. The signal was strong now, the map updating smoothly, but there was no record of a motel along that stretch of highway. No services, no rest area, nothing. I told myself I must have misread the sign in the storm, that fatigue had filled in details that weren't real, but the certainty I felt did not fade. I drove the rest of the way south without stopping. The holiday passed quietly, uneventfully, but the memory of that night followed me back home. Weeks later, curiosity pushed me to search for the motel online. There were no listings, no reviews, no photographs. I widened the search, checked archived maps, local records, anything that might explain it. The area where the motel should have been was marked as undeveloped land, a stretch of trees bordering the highway with no permits or structures recorded for decades. The nights after that changed. Sometimes, when I lay awake, I heard footsteps outside my apartment door, slow and measured, stopping just long enough to feel deliberate before moving on. Other times, when the weather turned cold and still, I heard tapping at the window. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. Always the same rhythm. When I looked, there was never anyone there, only my reflection staring back at me through the glass. I no longer stop at roadside motels after midnight. I don't take exits marked vaguely or trust lights glowing alone in the dark. I know now that some places exist only when the road is empty and the weather gives them permission, places that offer rest not because you need it, but because they want to see who accepts, and once they do, they remember. There is a kind of cold that does not feel sharp or painful but invasive, a cold that settles into places it does not belong, and stays long after you believe you have escaped it. I first noticed that cold during the winter I turned 40, when I took a holiday trip I had been postponing for years, because it required me to drive through towns I had spent most of my life trying not to remember. My name is Michael, and at the time I was living in western Pennsylvania, recently laid off from a manufacturing job that had closed without ceremony, its lights going dark one Friday afternoon as if the building itself had decided it was done pretending to matter. I told people the trip was for family, for obligation, for tradition, but the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I wanted to see whether the places I had left behind still recognized me, or whether I had finally become someone they no longer knew. The plan was straightforward. I would drive west across state lines, cut through a chain of small towns, and arrive before Christmas Eve, early enough to avoid the worst of the weather. The forecast called for snow, but nothing alarming, and I told myself I had driven these roads my entire life. Familiarity can be dangerous that way, convincing you that past experience offers protection against change. I left just after sunset, the sky already drained of color, the landscape flattened into dark shapes and scattered lights. The highway was quiet, the holiday traffic lighter than usual, and for the first hour the drive felt almost peaceful, the kind of solitude that allows thoughts to wander without urgency. Snow began falling gradually, thin at first, dusting the road without sticking. The radio played softly, a local station cycling through old seasonal songs that felt oddly disconnected from the darkness outside. As the miles passed, the snow thickened, the flakes growing heavier, slower, drifting across the road in uneven patterns that blurred the lane markings. The temperature dropped fast enough that the edges of the windshield frosted, despite the heater running steadily. I rolled my shoulders, adjusting my grip on the wheel, aware of the subtle shift in the drive from routine to effort. The road signs grew less frequent, the exits farther apart, the names unfamiliar enough that I stopped reading them closely. Somewhere past the last well-lit interchange, the highway narrowed into a 2-lane road without warning. The transition felt abrupt, as though the infrastructure itself had thinned out, leaving less between me and whatever lay beyond the reach of the headlights. Snow accumulated faster here, clinging to the asphalt and softening the sound of my tires. The world grew quieter, the radio signal weakening until the music dissolved into static and then silence. I turned it off, telling myself I didn't need the distraction, though the absence of sound made the dark feel heavier. The town appeared suddenly, announced not by signage but by a cluster of lights ahead, warm and steady against the snow. I slowed instinctively, watching as the road dipped slightly and led me between rows of houses set back from the street. They were small, modest structures, the kind built quickly decades ago and maintained just enough to keep standing. 6 or 7 of them lined the road, their porch lights glowing amber, windows lit from within, curtains drawn halfway as though someone had paused mid-motion and never finished. Snow covered the lawns evenly, untouched by footprints or tire tracks, despite the obvious signs of occupancy. I passed through slowly, unsettled by the stillness. No cars were parked along the street. No smoke rose from chimneys. The lights did not flicker or change as I drove by. It felt less like entering a town and more like passing through a preserved scene, frozen at a specific moment. The road curved gently, and for a moment I expected to see a main street or a sign announcing the town's name, but none appeared. Instead, the houses continued, evenly spaced, their lights unwavering, their windows reflecting the movement of my headlights without revealing anything inside. As I reached the end of the row, I noticed something that tightened my chest. The snow along the edge of the road was pressed down in long shallow impressions, forming a path that ran parallel to the street, close enough to the houses to suggest explainable origin, yet too uniform to feel natural. The impressions did not cross the road. They did not lead toward any door. They simply followed the line of houses, uninterrupted, as though something had walked the length of the street repeatedly, careful to stay just out of sight. I told myself I was projecting, that fatigue and weather were coloring my perception, but the feeling did not ease when I passed the last house, and the road opened into darkness again. Instead, it deepened, settling into my chest with the certainty that the town had not been empty. It had been attentive, and as the houses disappeared behind me, I realized the cold I felt had nothing to do with the snow, and everything to do with the sense that I had been noticed by something, that did not require me to stop in order to follow. I drove on for several minutes after the houses vanished, the road stretching ahead in a narrow ribbon of gray bordered by snow-laden trees. The forest closed in quickly, branches sagging low enough that my headlights caught them at odd angles, throwing warped shadows across the windshield. I tried to shake the feeling the town had left behind, telling myself it was nothing more than the unease that comes from passing through unfamiliar places at night, especially after years away. Still, I checked the rearview mirror more often than necessary. Half expecting to see headlights appear behind me, or the glow of porch lights returning in the distance. There was nothing there, only darkness and falling snow. The road curved gently, then sharply, descending into a shallow valley where the snowfall thickened without warning. Visibility dropped fast, the world beyond my headlights dissolving into white motion. I slowed, gripping the wheel tighter, feeling the subtle pull of the tires as they fought for traction. That was when the cold changed. It crept into the car in a way the heater didn't seem able to counter, not sharp or biting but pervasive, like dampness seeping through walls. The air felt heavier, carrying the same quiet pressure I had felt passing through the town. I glanced at the temperature gauge, expecting to see a dramatic drop, but the needle hadn't moved. A sign emerged through the snow ahead, smaller than the highway signs I was used to, mounted low and partially obscured by ice. I slowed enough to read it as I passed. No town name, no distance markers, just a single arrow pointing left and the word local in faded black lettering. I hesitated, instinctively leaning towards staying on the main road, but something about the narrowing visibility made the turn feel inevitable, as though the road ahead was closing itself off. I turned left. The local road was worse, narrower and uneven, the snow packed down into rutted tracks that guided the car more than I guided it. Trees crowded closer here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little light filtered through the cloud cover. The snow fell more softly beneath them, settling without sound, and the silence pressed in until even the engine felt intrusive. After a short distance, the road straightened and the trees thinned, opening into another small stretch of development. Houses appeared again, similar in size and shape to the ones I had just passed, though arranged differently, set back at uneven distances from the road. These houses felt wrong in a subtler way. Their lights were on, but not warmly. The glow from the windows was pale, almost colorless, as if filtered through layers of frost. Curtains hung motionless, and once again there were no cars, no footprints, no sign of recent movement despite the obvious signs of occupancy. I slowed further, scanning for a street sign, a mailbox with a readable name, anything that might anchor the place in reality. I saw none. The road continued straight through the houses without widening or narrowing, as though it had been threaded carefully between them. As I passed the third house, something moved in one of the windows. Not a person stepping into view, not a clear shape, just a subtle shift in the light, like someone standing just out of sight had leaned closer to the glass. My heart rate spiked, and I forced myself to keep driving, telling myself reflections played tricks at night, that snow and headlights distorted everything. The movement did not repeat, but the sense of being observed sharpened, settling between my shoulder blades like a physical weight. The impressions in the snow returned here, more pronounced now. They ran along the edge of the road, close enough to the houses that I could see where the snow had been pressed down repeatedly, forming a shallow continuous path. The spacing between the impressions was too consistent, the length between them too long. They did not branch toward any house. They did not cross the road. They simply followed the line of buildings, looping back somewhere beyond my view. The realization that this pattern mirrored the first town made my mouth go dry. It felt less like coincidence and more like a habit. I reached the end of the row and expected the road to curve back towards something familiar, but instead it ended abruptly at a T-intersection with no signage. Snow piled high at the edges, and beyond the intersection the forest resumed, dense and uninviting. I slowed to a stop, the engine idling louder than it should have in the quiet. For several seconds I sat there, trying to decide which direction made sense. Both paths disappeared into darkness. Neither offered reassurance. I checked my phone out of reflex and found no signal, the screen dimming faster than it should have. As I sat there, the lights in the houses behind me changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but one by one, the pale glow shifted warmer, deeper, closer to the amber light I remembered from the first town. The change happened slowly enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching. With each shift, the pressure in the air seemed to increase, the silence thickening until it felt like the night itself was waiting for something. I chose a direction at random and accelerated, the tires crunching softly through the snow as the car lurched forward. In the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement along the edge of the road, a long shadow gliding parallel to me, keeping pace just beyond the reach of the headlights. I did not slow down to look more closely. I kept driving, aware with growing certainty that the towns were not separate places at all, but repetitions of the same idea, rearranged and presented again and again until someone made the mistake of stopping. The road stretched forward in a way that felt artificial, the darkness ahead refusing to resolve into anything solid no matter how long I drove. Snow continued to fall, but it no longer felt like weather, it felt staged, a constant texture layered over everything else. The trees pressed in tightly, then loosened without warning, the pattern repeating as though the landscape were rearranging itself in small, deliberate increments. I focused on the road, on keeping the car steady, telling myself that as long as I stayed moving, I could not be absorbed into whatever rhythm those towns obeyed. The thought did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. After what felt like far too long for such a narrow road, the forest opened again, revealing another cluster of lights ahead. My stomach dropped before my mind fully registered what I was seeing. Houses appeared one by one, their shapes familiar now, the same modest structures spaced at measured intervals, 6 or 7 of them forming a shallow curve along the road. Porch lights glowed amber, windows shone softly through half-drawn curtains, and the snow lay smooth and undisturbed across the lawns. It was not identical to the first town or the second, but it was close enough to feel intentional, like variations on a theme. I slowed despite myself, dread and recognition tangled together. This time, I noticed the details more clearly. The houses were not aging naturally. The paint did not peel, the siding did not warp. Everything looked preserved, held at a specific point in time and never allowed to progress beyond it. The lights did not flicker when I passed. The curtains did not shift. The street showed no sign of use beyond the faint path in the snow running parallel to the road, pressed down in the same elongated impressions I had seen before. The path curved with the street, looping gently behind the houses, never crossing into view, never ending. As I drove through, the cold inside the car deepened. My breath fogged faintly despite the heater blowing steadily. The air felt thicker, resistant, as though it took effort to move through it. I glanced at the dashboard and felt a brief surge of panic when I realized the clock had stopped changing. The minutes did not advance. The seconds did not tick. Everything else appeared functional, but time itself seemed to have paused, suspended along with the houses and the snow. Halfway through the row, a light changed. One of the windows brightened subtly, the glow shifting closer to the glass. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye and forced myself to look directly at it. The window showed no figure, no silhouette, only the suggestion of depth, like something standing just beyond the curtain without pressing against it. Another window changed, then another, the light inching forward, gathering at the glass. The sense of attention became unbearable, a collective focus tightening around me as though the town itself had leaned inward. The engine sputtered. Just once, just enough to make my heart lurch. I pressed the accelerator harder, urging the car forward, and felt the tires struggle briefly before regaining traction. The road ahead dipped sharply, descending into a darker stretch where the trees closed in again. I did not look back. I kept my eyes forward, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. The houses vanished behind me, swallowed by the forest, but the feeling did not lift. If anything, it intensified, as though leaving the towns behind had only made their presence less visible, not less real. Eventually, the road widened. The snow thinned, the trees receded. Without warning, I found myself merging onto a familiar highway, its lanes clear, its signs bright and legible. Traffic appeared around me, sparse but real, the hum of other engines grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. The clock on the dashboard lurched forward, minutes advancing all at once as if correcting itself. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there for several minutes, hands shaking, waiting for the panic to subside. When I checked my route later, there was no record of the towns I had passed through. The map showed uninterrupted forest along the stretch where the local road should have been, no residential areas, no side streets, no points of interest. I searched property records, satellite images, anything that might confirm what I had seen. There was nothing. The land was listed as undeveloped, protected, untouched. I arrived at my destination just before dawn on Christmas Eve. Family asked about the drive, about the weather, about whether I'd had any trouble on the road. I told them it was quiet, that the snow slowed me down, nothing more. The truth felt impossible to explain without sounding unhinged. But in the days that followed, I noticed small changes. At night, when I looked out windows, I sometimes saw lights in places that should have been empty, glowing steadily until I focused on them, at which point they vanished. Once, walking home after dark, I found a faint path pressed into fresh snow along the edge of my street, running parallel to the houses, looping back on itself before disappearing. I do not take unfamiliar roads anymore. I avoid small towns at night, especially in winter, especially when the snow falls softly enough to erase sound. I understand now that some places do not exist to be lived in. They exist to be passed through, to be noticed, to be repeated until someone slows down enough to become part of the pattern. And I know, with a certainty that settles deeper each year, that those houses are still out there, lights on, waiting for the next familiar stranger to recognize them. There are holiday drives that feel routine enough to lull you into mistakes, trips you have made so many times that your body remembers them, even when your mind drifts elsewhere. I had driven that route every December for nearly a decade, always telling myself that familiarity made it safer, that knowing the exits and towns by heart somehow protected me from whatever winter decided to do. My name is Daniel, and that year I was 36, older than I felt and more tired than I liked to admit, heading north for a family gathering I had been postponing in small ways for years. The forecast mentioned snow, nothing unusual for the season, and I left late anyway, trusting the road the way people trust habits that have never betrayed them before. The highway emptied quickly after dark. Holiday traffic peeled off toward exits leading to malls and suburbs, leaving long stretches of asphalt that belonged almost entirely to me. Snow began falling softly, coating the road in a thin, uneven layer that dulled the sound of my tires. The radio faded in and out as I crossed county lines, voices warping briefly before dissolving into static. I turned it off without thinking, letting the quiet settle into the car. It felt heavier than silence usually does, thick enough to notice, but not yet uncomfortable. The storm intensified gradually, not with drama but with persistence. Flakes grew larger and slower, drifting sideways across the lanes and blurring the painted lines until they vanished beneath moving white. Visibility shrank to the reach of my headlights. I slowed instinctively, gripping the wheel tighter, aware of how quickly confidence thins when landmarks disappear. When the GPS lagged, then froze entirely, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the same unease that comes when something small goes wrong in a place where small problems do not stay small for long. I was looking for any sign of reassurance when I noticed the lights. They sat off to the right of the highway, clustered together just beyond a low line of trees. Warm lights, steady and amber, the kind that suggest houses rather than businesses. At first, I assumed it was a small town I had forgotten about or passed without noticing in past years. The sight brought an unexpected sense of relief. Towns meant plowed roads, open gas stations, people awake somewhere behind lit windows. As the snow thickened, that relief tipped the balance in my head. I took the exit without stopping to question it. The side road was narrower than the highway, the snow packed into smooth ruts that guided the car forward. Trees pressed in close, their branches heavy with ice, forming a loose canopy that swallowed the wind. Almost immediately, the storm softened. Snow still fell, but without sound, drifting gently as if released rather than thrown by the air. The quiet settled fast and deep, pressing in on the car until even the engine felt too loud. The houses appeared gradually, resolving from light into shape as I drove closer. There were 6 or 7 of them, small and modest, set back from the road at even intervals. Their porch lights glowed warmly, windows lit from within, curtains drawn halfway as though someone had paused mid-motion and never finished. Snow covered the lawns evenly. No cars sat in the driveways. No footprints marked the walkways. Despite the obvious signs of occupancy, the street felt unused, preserved in a way that made my skin prickle. I slowed further, scanning for a street sign or town name, anything that would tell me where I was. There was nothing. The road ran straight through the houses without widening into a main street or narrowing into a dead end. As I passed the third house, I noticed a shallow path pressed into the snow along the edge of the road. The impressions were long and evenly spaced, too consistent to be random, too far apart to belong to someone walking normally. The path did not branch toward any house. It did not cross the road. It simply followed the line of buildings, running parallel to the street like something pacing just out of sight. The feeling of being watched settled in quietly, without a clear source. The lights behind the windows did not change, but they felt closer somehow, as if the glow had shifted subtly toward the glass. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement behind me, but the road remained empty, snow drifting softly through the darkness. At the end of the row, the road curved gently instead of opening into an intersection. For a moment, I had the strange impression that it was bending back toward itself, folding the houses into a loop rather than leading me anywhere new. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, the heater struggling to keep up despite running at full strength. My breath fogged faintly in the air. I considered stopping. Knocking on a door, asking where I was. The thought felt both logical and deeply wrong, as though doing so would complete something I had accidentally started. I kept driving instead, my hands tight on the wheel, heart beating harder than the situation seemed to warrant. When the houses finally fell away behind me and the road returned me to the highway, the storm rushed back all at once, wind and snow reclaiming the space like a held breath released. I told myself it had been nothing more than a detour, a trick of weather and exhaustion. But as the highway stretched ahead and the night closed in again, the image of those houses stayed with me, along with the uneasy certainty that the town had not been empty. It had simply been waiting to see whether I would stop. I stayed on the highway longer than I needed to after leaving the side road, the snow thickening again as if the storm had been waiting for me to rejoin it before resuming its full weight. The wind returned in uneven bursts that nudged the car just enough to keep me alert, and I focused on the familiar rhythm of driving, telling myself that whatever I had passed was behind me now. The explanation I repeated in my head was simple enough to feel believable: an unmarked settlement, maybe a private development, something overlooked by maps but not by people who lived there. The problem was that the certainty I felt passing those houses did not fade with distance. It followed me, quiet and persistent, like a thought I could not finish. The heater struggled despite being set to its highest level. Warm air blew steadily from the vents, but it felt thin, as though it were being absorbed before it could settle. I flexed my fingers against the steering wheel, noticing how stiff they felt, how long it took for sensation to return when I shifted my grip. The dashboard clock blinked suddenly, the display dimming and then brightening again. I glanced at it out of habit and felt a flicker of unease, when I realized the time had not changed since I exited the side road. I watched it for several seconds, waiting for the minutes to advance. They didn't. I told myself electronics fail in cold weather all the time, but the explanation rang hollow even as I leaned on it. The road ahead narrowed again without warning, the highway thinning into a two-lane stretch bordered by trees that pressed closer with each mile. Snow accumulated faster here, clinging to the asphalt and dulling the sound of my tires. The radio remained silent, no signal returning, no static breaking through. The quiet felt heavier than before, as though the space around the car had thickened. When the snowfall softened once more, losing its sound entirely, a cold awareness settled into my chest. I had not changed direction. I had not taken another exit, and yet the storm behaved as though I had crossed an invisible boundary again. Lights appeared ahead, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I slowed instinctively, dread and recognition tangling together before I could separate them. The houses emerged from the darkness one by one, arranged along the road in a shallow curve. They were not identical to the first group, but they were close enough to feel deliberate. 6, maybe 7 structures, modest in size, set back the same careful distance. Porch lights glowed amber. Windows were lit. Curtains hung halfway drawn. Snow lay smooth across the lawns, unbroken by footprints or tire tracks. The scene carried the same preserved quality, like a photograph held in place by time rather than memory. The path in the snow was there again, pressed into the ground along the edge of the road. The impressions were longer now, more defined, forming a continuous shallow track that followed the line of houses without deviation. Seeing it a second time stripped away any lingering doubt. This was not coincidence, this was repetition. The realization made my mouth go dry, my breathing shallow. I scanned the houses for movement, for anything that might anchor them to reality, but nothing changed. The lights did not flicker. The curtains did not shift. As I drove through, the cold inside the car deepened. My breath fogged faintly despite the heater's effort. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the reach of the headlights, a long shadow gliding parallel to the road. It kept pace with me, neither gaining nor falling behind, its shape stretching and compressing with the uneven light. I told myself it was nothing more than my own reflection, the interplay of snow and darkness, but the certainty in my chest refused to listen. The road curved gently, looping through the houses in a way that felt designed rather than accidental. The pressure in the air increased, a sensation like standing too close to something large and mechanical that I could not see. One by one, the lights in the windows seemed to shift closer to the glass. They did not brighten dramatically. They focused, narrowing their glow as though attention itself had weight. The sense of being observed sharpened into something almost physical, pressing against my skin. I considered stopping again, the thought returning with more urgency this time. Knocking on a door, asking for directions. Proving to myself that these were ordinary people living ordinary lives. The instinct that rose to counter the thought was stronger, deeper, and far less rational. It warned me that stopping would complete something I did not understand, that movement was the only thing keeping me separate from whatever pattern the town followed. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, heart pounding hard enough to feel in my ears. At the far end of the row, the road dipped sharply and the trees closed in, swallowing the houses behind me. I accelerated without looking back, the engine protesting briefly before finding traction. The sense of being followed stretched with the distance, thinning but not disappearing, as though whatever had been pacing me no longer needed to remain visible. Even when the road widened and the snowfall regained its sound, the cold remained lodged inside the car, refusing to lift. Several long minutes passed before traffic appeared ahead, sparse but real, the glow of taillights grounding me in something familiar. The dashboard clock flickered again and jumped forward suddenly, correcting itself by several minutes at once. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, though it did not fade. I knew then that the houses were not isolated places. They were iterations, rearranged and presented again until someone slowed down enough to make the wrong choice. The highway eventually widened enough that the trees began to retreat, their dark shapes pulling back from the shoulders as though whatever boundary I had crossed was loosening its hold. Snow continued to fall, but it sounded different now, striking the windshield and roof with the familiar rhythm of weather, rather than the muted drift I had driven through earlier. Other vehicles appeared ahead, spaced far apart but undeniably present, their taillights steady and red against the white. The sight grounded me more than I expected. I hadn't realized how completely alone I had felt until I wasn't anymore. I kept driving for a long time without stopping, afraid that slowing down would let something catch up. The sense of pressure that had filled the car gradually thinned, retreating to a dull awareness rather than an immediate threat. Still, the cold lingered. Even with the heater blasting, my hands remained stiff on the wheel, my breath fogging faintly with each exhale. I checked the dashboard clock repeatedly, watching the minutes advance normally now, half expecting it to freeze again. It didn't. Time, at least, seemed to have released me. When I finally reached my destination hours later, the sky was beginning to pale at the edges, the first hint of dawn stretching thinly across the horizon. The town looked ordinary in the morning light, familiar streets, parked cars dusted with snow, porch lights switching off one by one as people woke to another winter day. Family greeted me with tired smiles and casual questions about the drive, about the weather, about whether the roads had been bad. I told them the snow slowed me down, nothing more. The truth felt too unstable to explain, as though saying it aloud might give it permission to settle. I slept poorly that night, and the nights that followed were no better. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw those houses again, their light steady and patient, arranged just far enough apart to suggest choice where there was none. I dreamed of roads that folded back on themselves, of driving without ever reaching an intersection, of snow that fell without sound. In the dreams, I always knew I was being watched, not by figures in windows or shadows in the trees, but by the spaces between things, by the places where movement paused. Days passed, then weeks, and the intensity of the memory dulled without disappearing. I tried to research the area, pulling up maps and satellite images, tracing the stretch of highway where I was certain I had taken the exit. There were no towns marked there, no residential roads branching off, no record of development. The land was listed as protected forest, untouched, its boundaries clearly defined. I widened the search, checked older maps, zoning records, anything that might explain what I had seen. There was nothing. It was as though the place had never existed beyond the moment I passed through it. The first sign that the experience had followed me came one night, after a light snowfall back home. I was walking down my own street, the houses familiar, their shapes comforting in their predictability, when I noticed a shallow path pressed into the snow along the curb. It ran parallel to the line of houses, too even to be accidental, the impression spaced farther apart than a normal stride. The path looped back on itself near the end of the block, fading where the snow grew thinner. I stood there longer than I should have, the cold biting through my coat, telling myself it was nothing more than plow damage or an animal track distorted by melting. The explanation felt weak, but I clung to it anyway. After that, I began to notice lights in places that should have been dark. Windows glowing briefly in abandoned buildings. Houses that appeared occupied at night and empty by morning. Once, driving home late, I passed a side street I didn't recognize, lined with small houses whose porch lights glowed amber against fresh snow. The sight made my stomach drop. When I slowed to look again, the street was gone, replaced by a row of trees and a chain-link fence dusted with frost. I do not take unfamiliar exits anymore, especially in winter. I avoid side roads that branch off without signage and towns that appear without warning. I keep driving, even when the lights ahead look warm and inviting, even when the road grows quiet enough to feel staged. I understand now that some places are not destinations. They are patterns, repeated until someone mistakes familiarity for safety. And when winter comes, when the snow falls softly enough to erase sound, those places are still out there, rearranging themselves patiently, waiting for the next person who believes the road only ever leads forward. There are certain American holidays that make travel feel unavoidable, stretches of time when the roads fill with obligation rather than excitement, and you drive not because you want to arrive but because staying put feels worse. That was how I found myself on the interstate 3 days before Christmas, heading east through a part of the country I normally avoided once winter set in. I had delayed the trip as long as I could, telling myself work needed me, that the weather would be bad, that there was no real reason to rush. In truth, I was stalling because every mile closer to my destination felt like reopening something I had spent years sealing shut. Snow had been falling since early afternoon, steady but manageable, and I convinced myself that leaving after dark would be fine, that the worst of the traffic would already be gone. The highway was quiet in that peculiar holiday way, not empty but restrained, as if everyone left on the road shared an unspoken agreement to keep moving and mind their own business. Snow coated the lanes evenly, dulling the sound of tires and softening the world into a narrow corridor lit by headlights and taillights. The radio faded in and out as I crossed state lines, voices thinning into static before disappearing entirely. I didn't bother turning it back on. Silence felt easier than listening to music that reminded me what time of year it was. After several hours, the snowfall thickened without warning. Visibility dropped fast, the road ahead shrinking until it felt less like a destination and more like a suggestion. The shoulders vanished beneath drifting snow, and the familiar green exit signs appeared later and later, their reflective surfaces muted by ice. When my GPS lagged, then froze, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same quiet alarm that goes off when something dependable stops responding. I told myself it would correct itself, that winter interfered with signals all the time. But I slowed anyway, scanning the dark for anything that looked like certainty. That was when I saw the lights. They were low and scattered, not the clustered brightness of a town center but the individual glow of buildings set apart from one another. Warm lights, steady and amber, hovering just beyond a break in the trees. For a moment, relief washed through me. Lights meant people. People meant help if the storm worsened. I checked the faded sign near the exit, its lettering partially obscured by snow, and caught only the word "Market" before I passed it. I didn't remember a town there, but that didn't mean much. Plenty of places slipped through memory unnoticed. I took the exit. The road narrowed immediately, the snow packed into smooth ruts that guided the car forward. Trees closed in on both sides, their branches heavy with ice, forming a corridor that muted the sound of the wind. Almost at once, the storm softened. Snow still fell, but without force, drifting gently as if placed rather than thrown. The quiet pressed in fast, deep enough that the engine sounded intrusive. I drove slower, my focus narrowing to the stretch of road illuminated ahead. The lights resolved into buildings as I approached, a small cluster arranged along a single main road. There was a grocery store with its sign lit but unreadable beneath snow, a gas station with pumps standing idle, and several small houses set back behind them, their windows glowing warmly. Everything looked functional, maintained, but strangely inactive. No cars moved through the intersection. No figures crossed the road. The snow lay smooth and unbroken across parking lots and sidewalks, untouched by footprints or tire tracks despite the obvious signs of recent use. I slowed almost to a stop, unsettled by the stillness. The grocery store lights were on, the interior clearly visible through wide glass windows, shelves stocked, aisles clear, as if it were ready to open at any moment. The gas station canopy glowed softly, but the pumps were dark, hoses hanging in neat loops. The houses beyond them looked lived in, curtains drawn halfway, lamps lit, but no movement disturbed the glow. It felt less like a town settling in for the night and more like a place paused mid-action. As I drove through, I noticed a shallow path pressed into the snow along the edge of the road. It ran past the storefronts and continued toward the houses, the impressions long and evenly spaced. They were too consistent to be random, too far apart to belong to someone walking normally. The path did not lead to the doors. It did not cross the street. It simply followed the line of buildings, looping behind them where my headlights couldn't reach. The sight tightened something in my chest. I checked the mirrors, half expecting to see movement behind me, but the road remained empty. I passed the last building and expected the road to return me to the highway, but instead it curved gently, leading deeper into the cluster of lights. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, the heater struggling to compensate. My breath fogged faintly in the air. For the first time since taking the exit, the thought occurred to me that this place might not exist to serve travelers at all. It might exist to see who slowed down enough to notice it. I considered turning around, but the road ahead narrowed, guiding me forward with the same quiet insistence that had drawn me off the highway in the first place. The lights behind me remained steady, patient, as though they knew I would keep driving. And as the snow continued to fall without sound, I understood with growing unease that whatever this place was, it had already registered my arrival. The road narrowed further as I followed it past the last storefront, the buildings falling away behind me while the lights remained, stretching forward in a way that felt deliberate. Snow continued to fall softly, settling without sound, and the silence pressed in until it felt like a presence of its own. The car moved smoothly through the packed ruts, guided more by the shape of the road than by any decision I consciously made. I told myself I would reach the highway again in a moment, that this was just a small commercial strip tucked away from the main route, but the reassurance thinned with every second that passed. Another cluster of buildings emerged ahead, smaller this time, more residential. 6 houses sat along the road, spaced evenly, their porch lights glowing the same warm amber I had already begun to associate with unease. The windows were lit, curtains drawn just far enough to suggest activity without revealing it. Snow covered the lawns smoothly, untouched by footprints, and the driveways were empty. No cars, no tire marks. The sameness unsettled me. It wasn't just that the houses looked similar, it was that they felt arranged, like pieces placed carefully rather than built over time. I slowed further, my eyes scanning for movement. Nothing shifted behind the curtains. No doors opened. The only change was the subtle way the light in the windows seemed to concentrate as I passed, edging closer to the glass without brightening. The sensation of being watched sharpened, settling between my shoulder blades with uncomfortable clarity. I checked the rearview mirror and saw the grocery store lights still glowing behind me, farther away than they should have been given how slowly I was driving. Distance felt unreliable here, elastic in a way that made my stomach tighten. The shallow path in the snow appeared again, more defined now. It ran along the edge of the road, pressed deep and continuous, looping past the houses without branching toward any of them. The impressions were longer than a normal stride, evenly spaced, and too deliberate to dismiss. I followed the line of the path instinctively, my headlights tracing its curve as it disappeared behind the houses. The thought crept in uninvited, that whatever had made those impressions had not been traveling toward a destination. It had been pacing. The heater sputtered, the warm air thinning abruptly before returning in uneven bursts. I flexed my fingers on the steering wheel, noticing how stiff they felt, how slowly sensation returned. The dashboard clock flickered, the numbers dimming and brightening before settling on a time I didn't recognize. I watched it for several seconds, waiting for the minutes to advance. They didn't. The silence inside the car deepened, broken only by the soft crunch of tires on snow. As I passed the third house, a shadow shifted in one of the windows. Not a clear figure, not a silhouette I could point to, just a subtle movement that suggested someone had stepped closer to the curtain without pulling it aside. My heart rate spiked, and I fought the urge to stop, to prove to myself that there were ordinary people living there. The instinct that rose up to counter the thought was stronger, heavier, warning me that stopping would not bring clarity. It would bring recognition. The road curved gently, looping in on itself in a way that made it difficult to tell how far I had traveled. The grocery store lights appeared again ahead, closer than they should have been, as though I had circled back without noticing the turn. Panic stirred at the edges of my thoughts. I checked the mirrors, then the dashboard, then the road ahead, trying to anchor myself in something measurable. Everything looked the same. Snow falling without sound, lights glowing steadily. No movement beyond the narrow reach of my headlights. I accelerated, ignoring the way the road seemed to resist the change in speed. The engine responded sluggishly, as though pushing against something heavier than air. The lights ahead did not rush closer. They held their distance, patient, unbothered by my effort. The path in the snow kept pace alongside me, the impression sliding past at the same steady rhythm, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. The pressure in the air increased, a sensation like standing too close to a large object you cannot see. My breath fogged faintly despite the heater's effort, and the cold felt less like temperature and more like occupancy, as though the space inside the car had been claimed by something that did not belong there. I became acutely aware of how quiet everything was, how completely sound had been stripped away. Then, without warning, the lights shifted. Not all at once, but gradually, the glow from the windows and storefronts narrowing, focusing, as though attention itself were being drawn inward. The grocery store sign flickered briefly, its letters almost legible for a fraction of a second before blurring again beneath snow. I caught the word "Market" clearly this time, and beneath it, in smaller lettering I hadn't noticed before, something else. The letters were faint, partially obscured, but I was certain of what they spelled. Return. The realization sent a jolt of cold through me. I understood then that this place was not meant to be passed through casually. It was designed to loop, to hold, to encourage hesitation until movement itself felt like an intrusion. The road ahead narrowed once more, guiding me forward with quiet insistence. Behind me, the lights remained steady, unthreatening, patient. Whatever this town was, it did not need to chase. It only needed to wait. The word stayed with me as I drove, lingering in my thoughts long after the sign itself slipped back into the blur of snow and light. Return did not feel like a warning so much as a suggestion, the kind offered patiently, without urgency, because refusal was already accounted for. I focused on the road, on the steady movement of the car, telling myself that as long as I kept driving forward, the loop would break on its own. The idea felt thin even as I leaned on it. The road ahead stretched on, unchanging, the lights maintaining their careful distance no matter how long I drove. The grocery store appeared again, this time on my left instead of my right, its windows glowing softly through the snowfall. Panic flared sharp and immediate. I had not turned around. I was certain of it. I replayed the last several minutes in my head, searching for a missed intersection or a curve I hadn't noticed, but the memory refused to cooperate. The road had guided me forward in a straight, unbroken line. And yet, there it was, the same building, the same unreadable sign, the same empty parking lot smoothed clean by snow. I slowed to a stop without fully deciding to. The engine idled loudly in the silence, the sound jarring in a space that seemed to reject noise. I sat there, hands resting on the wheel, breath shallow, watching the building as though it might change if I waited long enough. The lights inside the store brightened subtly, not flickering but focusing, drawing attention toward the entrance. The glass doors reflected my headlights back at me, doubling the light, making it difficult to see inside. I told myself to turn around, to reverse back onto the road, but the thought felt distant, disconnected from my body. The shallow path in the snow curved toward the store now, breaking its earlier pattern. The impressions pressed closer together as they approached the entrance, as though whatever had made them had slowed deliberately. Seeing that change snapped something loose in my chest. I shifted the car into gear and accelerated, the tires spinning briefly before catching. The road ahead opened suddenly, the buildings falling away faster than they had any right to, as though the town itself were receding rather than being left behind. The silence broke all at once. Wind rushed back in sharp bursts, the snow striking the windshield audibly, the familiar chaos of weather reclaiming the space. Trees pressed in along the road, then thinned, and without warning I found myself merging onto the highway, the lanes wide and clearly marked, traffic sparse but real. The dashboard clock lurched forward, minutes advancing in a way that made me wince, as though time had been released abruptly rather than resumed naturally. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there, hands shaking, waiting for my breathing to steady. The highway signs were familiar, the town names real, the distance markers reassuring in their specificity. I stayed there longer than necessary, afraid that pulling back into traffic might somehow undo the fragile sense of normalcy settling around me. Eventually, I drove on, reaching my destination without further incident, the rest of the trip passing in a blur of exhaustion and forced calm. I told myself the experience would fade, that it would become another strange story dulled by time and distance. It didn't. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing small things that felt uncomfortably familiar. Grocery stores late at night with fully stocked shelves and no customers. Gas stations glowing warmly with pumps standing idle. Streets lined with houses whose lights were on despite the absence of cars or footprints in fresh snow. Each time, the sight triggered the same quiet tightening in my chest, the same instinct to keep moving. The clearest sign came one evening after a light snowfall, when I stepped outside my apartment and noticed a shallow path pressed into the snow along the curb. It ran parallel to the row of buildings, looping back on itself near the end of the block. The impressions were long and evenly spaced, too deliberate to ignore. I stood there, breath fogging in the cold, telling myself it was nothing more than a plow mark or an animal track distorted by melting. The explanation felt weak, but I accepted it because the alternative felt heavier. I avoid small towns now, especially during the holidays. I do not take exits marked vaguely or follow lights that appear without context. I keep driving, even when the road grows quiet enough to feel staged, even when the snow falls softly enough to erase sound. I understand now that some places are not meant to be destinations. They are invitations, extended patiently, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to accept. And I know, with a certainty that settles deeper each winter, that the town is still out there, lights on, shelves stocked, ready to welcome anyone who mistakes stillness for safety, and believes that returning is the same as leaving. There are stretches of America where winter doesn't just arrive, it settles in and refuses to leave, places where the cold feels less like weather and more like an agreement everyone has silently accepted. I was driving through one of those regions the week after New Year's, heading south after a holiday visit that had lasted longer than planned, the kind of visit where conversations repeat themselves and the past is never quite done being discussed. My name is Mark, I was 39 at the time, and I had lived long enough to know that long drives after emotional goodbyes make you careless in small, dangerous ways. I left before dawn, hoping to beat the worst of the snow, telling myself that familiarity with winter roads counted for something. The highway was nearly empty, the sky still dark and low, pressing against the road as though it hadn't decided whether morning was worth the effort. Snow fell lightly at first, a fine powder that dulled sound without obscuring vision. The radio played quietly, a local station cycling through early morning talk, voices steady and detached. As the miles passed, the signal weakened, words stretching and breaking apart before dissolving into static. I turned it off, preferring the hum of the engine to a conversation that kept slipping away. The quiet felt manageable at first, a neutral space where thoughts could drift without urgency. That changed when the temperature dropped suddenly. Frost crept along the edges of the windshield despite the heater working steadily, and the snow thickened into heavy, deliberate flakes that fell straight down rather than drifting. Visibility shrank gradually, the road ahead losing definition until it felt less like a destination and more like a suggestion. I slowed, hands tightening on the wheel, watching for familiar landmarks. The exit signs appeared later than expected, their reflective surfaces muted by ice, and the shoulders disappeared beneath drifting snow. When my GPS lagged and froze, I felt the first real flicker of unease. The screen locked mid-update, then went blank entirely, leaving only a dim reflection of my own face staring back at me. I told myself it was temporary, that cold interfered with electronics all the time, but the loss of that small reassurance made the dark beyond the headlights feel closer. I considered pulling over, but the snow along the shoulder looked deep and uneven. Stopping felt like inviting a different set of problems. I was scanning the roadside for anything recognizable when I noticed the building. It sat alone beyond the tree line, set back from the highway just far enough that it could have been missed in clearer weather. A long, low structure with a wide roof and a row of tall windows facing the road, each one glowing softly with pale light. At first glance, it looked like an old community center or school, the kind built decades ago and maintained just enough to stay in use. There was no sign visible from the highway, no indication of its purpose, but the sight of light in the storm stirred a familiar sense of relief. Buildings meant people. People meant warmth, help, certainty. As I drew closer, I noticed a narrow access road branching off toward it, the snow there packed down into smooth ruts that suggested recent use. I hesitated longer than I should have, weighing the comfort of staying on the highway against the pull of having somewhere solid to stop. The decision came quietly. I turned. The access road muted sound almost immediately, the tires crunching softly through packed snow. Trees lined both sides, their branches heavy and still, forming a corridor that swallowed the wind. The snowfall softened as I drove, losing its edge, drifting rather than striking the ground. The silence deepened until it felt deliberate, as though the space around the car had been prepared in advance. The building grew larger as I approached, its windows tall and narrow, spaced evenly along the front. Snow lay smooth across the wide parking area, but tire tracks cut through it in long looping arcs that did not lead to any obvious entrances. The tracks circled the building once, then twice, overlapping themselves in a pattern that felt intentional rather than careless. I slowed, unsettled by the sight. If someone had arrived recently, why hadn't they parked? I stopped near the front entrance, the engine idling louder than it should have in the quiet. The building looked well kept despite its age, the doors intact, the windows clean. Light filled the interior, but I could not see movement through the glass, only shapes suggesting long hallways and open rooms beyond. The air outside was colder than the surrounding forest, sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped out of the car. I stood there for a moment, listening. There was no wind, no distant traffic, just the soft tick of my engine cooling and the faint hum of electricity coming from inside the building. I walked toward the entrance, my boots leaving the first clear footprints across the smooth snow. As I reached the doors, I noticed something that made me pause. The glass was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been given the temperature. Behind it, the light seemed to shift subtly, not flickering but concentrating, as though something inside had adjusted its attention. I told myself I was projecting, that exhaustion and cold were shaping my perception, and reached for the handle. Before I touched it, I caught my reflection in the glass. For a brief moment, it didn't move the way I did. The delay was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. When the reflection corrected itself, matching my movement perfectly, I stepped back, heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. The building remained silent, patient, its windows glowing steadily through the falling snow. I realized then that I had not seen a single sign indicating what the place was meant to be. No school name, no community notice, no hours posted on the door. Just light, warmth, and the unmistakable impression that the building had been waiting long before I arrived. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand hovering inches from the door handle, listening to the quiet hum that seemed to come from inside the building rather than from any visible source. The warmth radiating through the glass felt wrong, not comforting, but invasive, as though the heat belonged to something contained rather than something offered. Snow continued to fall behind me without sound, settling gently across the parking lot and my own footprints, softening their edges almost as soon as I made them. The sense of isolation deepened, the highway feeling suddenly distant and theoretical, like a memory rather than a place I could return to easily. I told myself I would just look inside, that there was no harm in confirming what the building was before leaving. The explanation sounded reasonable in my head, familiar even, the kind people use when curiosity and unease overlap. I pulled the door open slowly. It did not creak or resist. It swung inward with a smoothness that suggested recent use, releasing a wash of warm air that smelled faintly of dust and something metallic beneath it. The contrast with the cold outside was immediate and disorienting, my breath catching as my body adjusted. Inside, the space opened into a wide hallway with high ceilings and pale walls that reflected the light evenly, eliminating deep shadows. The floor was clean, the surface polished to a dull sheen that caught my reflection in distorted fragments. Long corridors branched off on either side, their doorways open, revealing empty rooms filled with stacked chairs, folding tables, and shelves lined with indistinct supplies. Everything was arranged neatly, as though prepared for use and then abandoned at the last moment. There were no signs of recent activity, no coats hung near the entrance, no scattered papers, no trash. The air was still, heavy in a way that made sound feel unwelcome. I took a few cautious steps inside, letting the door swing closed behind me. The click of the latch echoed softly down the hall, the sound carrying farther than it should have. Almost immediately, the hum I had heard outside grew more noticeable, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floor rather than the air. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, steady enough that I began to feel it in my chest rather than hear it in my ears. I paused, listening, trying to identify its source. The building did not offer any answers. The corridors felt longer than they looked, the distances stretching subtly as I moved. I passed doorways that opened into rooms too large for the building's exterior footprint to reasonably contain, their far walls receding into pale light without clear boundaries. In one room, rows of chairs faced a blank wall where a stage might have been. In another, tables were arranged in long lines, their surfaces bare except for faint impressions suggesting something heavy had been placed there repeatedly and then removed. The repetition unsettled me. It felt like the building remembered use even if the use itself was gone. I became aware of footprints that were not my own. They appeared faintly on the polished floor, visible only at certain angles, impressions where dust had been disturbed and then resettled. The prints were elongated, the stride longer than normal, and they did not form a clear path toward any specific room. Instead, they looped through the corridors, circling back on themselves, overlapping in places until the pattern became difficult to follow. The sight made my mouth go dry. Whatever had walked these halls had not been going anywhere. It had been pacing. The hum deepened as I moved farther from the entrance, the vibration becoming more pronounced beneath my feet. I felt it through the soles of my boots, a steady pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat if I let my attention linger on it. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that turning back would be the sensible choice, that there was no reason to explore further. The problem was that the idea of leaving felt less immediate than it should have, as though the building were subtly rearranging my priorities, encouraging curiosity over caution. I reached what looked like a central hall, wider than the others, its ceiling rising higher into shadow. The light here was brighter, more concentrated, though I could not see its source. The hum resonated more strongly, the vibration now unmistakable, and I realized with a jolt that it matched the rhythm of the tire tracks I had seen outside, the looping arcs circling the building again and again. The connection tightened something in my chest. This place was not static. It was active in ways that did not require movement. At the far end of the hall stood a set of double doors, their surfaces unmarked, the handles polished smooth by repeated use. I stopped several feet short of them, an instinctive resistance rising up that had nothing to do with fear in the usual sense. It felt more like recognition, the understanding that crossing that threshold would complete something I did not fully grasp. The hum intensified slightly, the air growing warmer, heavier. I became acutely aware of my own reflection in the polished floor, elongated and distorted, my movements trailing a fraction of a second behind my intent. The building remained silent, patient, offering no urgency and no reassurance. I stood there, caught between the desire to leave and the unsettling sense that the building had been waiting for me to reach exactly this point. And for the first time since turning off the highway, I understood that this place did not exist to shelter travelers from winter. It existed to see how far they would go once they stepped inside. I don't know how long I stood there facing the double doors, listening to the low vibration ripple through the floor and up into my bones. Time felt elastic inside the building, stretching and compressing without clear markers, and the longer I remained still, the more the hum seemed to align itself with my breathing, as if waiting for me to fall into its rhythm completely. The air was warmer here, heavy enough that each breath felt deliberate, and the light pressed down from above without revealing its source, flattening shadows rather than casting them. The building felt awake, not alert in a human sense, but attentive, like something that had noticed a familiar pattern repeating. The realization sharpened suddenly and without drama. The tire tracks outside, the looping footprints inside, the arrangement of rooms that invited movement without destination, all of it pointed to the same function. This place was not meant to be occupied briefly. It was designed to hold people in motion until stillness felt unnatural, until leaving felt like interruption rather than escape. The thought cut through the fog of unease clearly enough to bring panic with it. I took a step back, then another, turning away from the doors and retracing my path toward the entrance. The corridors resisted subtly. Not by closing or changing shape, but by feeling longer than they had moments before, the distance stretching just enough to register. The hum deepened as I moved, not louder, but closer, vibrating through the floor in a way that felt personal, intimate. My reflection slid along the polished surface beneath me, lagging behind my movements by a fraction of a second too long to ignore. Each time I slowed, it slowed later. Each time I stepped forward, it followed with delay. I forced myself not to look down again. When the entrance finally came into view, relief surged sharp and immediate. The glass doors glowed faintly with daylight filtered through falling snow, a reminder that the outside world still existed. I quickened my pace, boots striking the floor louder now, the sound echoing down the corridors behind me. The building did not react overtly. There were no alarms, no sudden changes in light or temperature. The patience remained, heavy and unbroken, as though it did not need to hurry. I reached the doors and pulled them open, the cold air rushing in with enough force to steal my breath. The contrast was shocking, sharp and grounding, and I stepped outside without hesitation, letting the door swing shut behind me. The hum faded instantly, replaced by the familiar sounds of winter, the faint whisper of snow settling and the distant rush of wind through trees. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, waiting for the sense of pressure to lift. It didn't vanish entirely, but it loosened enough that I could think clearly again. The parking lot looked unchanged. Snow covered the ground smoothly, my footprints leading from the car to the entrance already softening at the edges. The looping tire tracks were still there, circling the building in overlapping arcs that made no practical sense. I walked back to my car quickly, glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see movement behind the windows. The light inside remained steady, indifferent, offering no sign that anything had noticed my departure. The drive back to the highway felt shorter than it should have. The access road returned me to the interstate without resistance. The storm resuming its full voice as though nothing had interrupted it. Traffic was sparse but real, the presence of other vehicles grounding me in familiar reality. The GPS flickered back to life without explanation, the map updating smoothly as if it had never failed. I didn't slow down, I didn't look back. The rest of the drive passed without incident, but the sense of unease stayed with me, settling into a quiet awareness rather than fading. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about the building more often than I wanted to admit. Not in flashes of fear, but in quieter moments, when routines fell away and my mind had space to wander. I wondered how many times that place had been entered and exited without consequence, how many people had walked those halls and left without noticing the patterns forming beneath their feet. Weeks later, after another snowfall, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the parking lot outside my apartment, tire tracks looped around the building in long, overlapping arcs before leading away. They didn't correspond to any obvious maneuver, no attempt to park or turn around. They simply circled once, then twice, before disappearing beneath fresh snow. I told myself it was coincidence, that winter driving produces strange marks all the time, but the explanation felt thin. Since then, I pay closer attention to places that feel too prepared, buildings that glow warmly in the cold without clear purpose. I don't step inside structures that offer shelter without context, especially not when the roads are quiet and the snow falls softly enough to erase sound. I understand now that some places are not destinations. They are systems, built to observe how people move when they believe they are alone. And somewhere along a forgotten stretch of highway, that building is still standing, lights on, halls waiting, patient enough to know that winter will eventually send someone else looking for warmth. There is a certain kind of winter night in America, when travel feels less like movement and more like suspension, when the roads stretch on without offering progress and the cold settles into everything with quiet authority. I found myself driving through one of those nights in late January, heading west after a work assignment that had ended without resolution, the kind that leaves you tired in ways rest doesn't fix. My name is Andrew, I was 41 then, recently separated, living out of hotels more than my own apartment, and convincing myself that motion counted as momentum. The forecast mentioned snow but nothing severe, and I left anyway, trusting experience and deadlines more than instinct. The highway emptied early, traffic thinning until the road felt private, a narrow ribbon of asphalt laid out just for me. Snow fell lightly at first, dusting the lanes without sticking, the flakes melting as soon as they touched the windshield. The radio held a steady signal for a while, voices calm and distant, then began to slip, words stretching thin before dissolving into static. I turned it off without thinking. Silence felt easier than listening to conversations that didn't include me. The hum of the engine and the steady sweep of the wipers became the only markers of time. As the miles passed, the snowfall thickened, the flakes growing heavier and slower, drifting across the road in uneven patterns that blurred the lane markings. The temperature dropped sharply enough that frost crept along the edges of the windshield despite the heater running at full strength. I slowed, hands tightening on the wheel, aware of how quickly confidence thins when familiar landmarks disappear. The exit signs appeared later and later, their reflective surfaces dulled by ice, and the shoulders vanished beneath drifting snow. When my GPS lagged and froze, unease settled in quietly, without panic, like a warning delivered too late to prevent anything. The screen locked mid-update and then went dark, leaving only a dim reflection of my face staring back at me. I told myself it would correct itself, that cold interfered with electronics all the time, but the loss of that small certainty made the dark beyond the headlights feel closer. Pulling over didn't feel like an option. The snow along the shoulder looked deep and uneven, and stopping felt like inviting a different set of problems. I was scanning the roadside for anything familiar when I noticed the sign. It stood just beyond the tree line, partially buried in snow, its lettering faded and uneven. I caught only one word as I passed it: apartments. The arrow pointed down a narrow access road branching off the highway. The idea of apartments that far from town struck me as odd, but the sight of any structure in the storm stirred a reflexive sense of relief. Buildings meant people. People meant warmth, lights, certainty. I hesitated longer than I should have, weighing the comfort of staying on the highway against the pull of having somewhere solid to stop. The decision came quietly. I turned. The access road muted sound almost immediately. The tires crunched softly through packed snow, and the wind died down as trees closed in on both sides, their branches heavy and still. Snow continued to fall, but without force, drifting gently as if placed rather than thrown. The quiet deepened until it felt deliberate, the kind that presses in rather than simply existing. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing a straight stretch of road that felt longer than it should have been. The buildings appeared gradually, resolving from shadow into shape as I drew closer. 3 low apartment blocks stood arranged around a wide open lot, their windows glowing softly through half-drawn curtains. The lights were warm, steady, the kind meant to suggest safety. Snow covered the ground evenly, smooth and untouched, despite the obvious signs of occupancy. There were no cars parked near the buildings. No footprints marked the walkways. The scene felt preserved rather than lived in, like a model arranged carefully and left undisturbed. I slowed, unsettled by the stillness. The parking lot was wide and empty, the snow unbroken except for a series of long, looping tire tracks that circled the buildings repeatedly, without leading to any parking spaces. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss. Whoever had driven there hadn't arrived or left. They had paced. I parked near the edge of the lot, the engine idling louder than it should have in the quiet. As I stepped out of the car, the cold hit harder than expected, sharp enough to sting my lungs. The air felt heavier here, carrying a faint metallic edge beneath the clean smell of snow. I stood for a moment, listening. There was no wind, no distant traffic. Just the soft tick of my engine cooling and the low hum of electricity coming from the buildings. The windows glowed steadily, revealing glimpses of furnished rooms inside, couches, lamps, dining tables set neatly as though waiting. I walked toward the nearest building, my boots leaving the first clear footprints across the smooth snow. The glass doors at the entrance were warm to the touch, warmer than they should have been given the temperature. Inside, a hallway stretched back into pale light, its floor polished to a dull sheen. I could see no movement, no shadows passing behind walls, yet the sense of being observed settled in quietly, without a clear source. I told myself I would step inside just long enough to warm up, maybe find someone to ask where I was, and then leave. The explanation felt reasonable, familiar, the kind people use when curiosity and unease overlap. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed something that made me pause. My reflection in the glass lagged slightly behind my movement, correcting itself just a fraction of a second too late. The delay was small enough to doubt, but not small enough to ignore. The building remained silent, patient, its windows glowing steadily through the falling snow. I realized then that I had not seen a single sign identifying the complex, no name, no unit numbers posted outside, nothing to suggest who lived there or why. Just light, warmth, and the unmistakable impression that the apartments had been waiting long before I arrived. I stood there longer than I meant to, my hand hovering near the door handle as the low hum from inside the building became more noticeable. It wasn't loud, not something you would consciously register at first, but once I noticed it, it was impossible to ignore, a steady vibration that seemed to travel through the glass and into my fingertips. Snow continued to fall behind me without sound, settling across the parking lot and softening the tire tracks that circled the buildings. The quiet felt contained, as though the complex existed inside a pocket where outside rules arrived late, if at all. I told myself I would only step inside for a moment, long enough to warm up and get my bearings. The door opened easily, swinging inward without resistance, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something metallic beneath it. The contrast made my head swim briefly. Inside, the hallway stretched farther than the building's exterior suggested, its walls painted a pale neutral color that reflected light evenly and eliminated deep shadows. The floor was clean, polished just enough to show distorted reflections of the ceiling lights and my own movements. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click that echoed farther than it should have. I paused, listening. The hum deepened, not louder, but closer, as though I had stepped nearer to its source without moving toward anything specific. Doors lined the hallway on either side, each one identical, painted the same off-white, their numbers absent or removed entirely. No mailboxes hung on the walls. No welcome mat sat outside the doors. The absence of personal detail unsettled me more than outright decay would have. It felt curated, like a place designed to look occupied without revealing who did the occupying. I walked slowly, my footsteps sounding dull against the polished floor. Through some of the open doorways, I glimpsed furnished apartments that looked ready to be lived in but untouched. Couches sat perfectly aligned with coffee tables. Lamps were turned on, casting warm pools of light. Kitchens were stocked with dishes neatly arranged in cabinets visible through glass doors. Bedrooms held neatly made beds without a single wrinkle. Everything looked paused, as though the residents had stepped out together and forgotten to come back. As I moved farther down the hallway, I noticed faint impressions on the floor. They were not footprints in the usual sense, not marks left by dirt or moisture, but subtle disturbances in the dustless sheen, visible only when the light hit them at the right angle. The impressions were elongated, the stride longer than normal, and they looped back on themselves, overlapping in places until the pattern became difficult to follow. The realization settled slowly and unpleasantly. Whatever had made them had not been traveling between apartments. It had been pacing. The hum grew stronger near the center of the building, the vibration now noticeable beneath my boots. It resonated through the floor, steady and rhythmic, and I became aware that it matched the looping pattern of the tire tracks outside. The connection tightened something in my chest. Movement without destination. Circles without arrival. I slowed instinctively, every sense alert, the quiet pressing in harder the longer I stood still. I reached a wider section of the hallway that opened into a communal space, a lounge of sorts with couches arranged in careful symmetry around low tables. The lights here were brighter, more focused, yet I could not see a single fixture producing them. The air felt warmer, heavier, and the hum vibrated through my ribs rather than my ears. I had the unsettling impression that the room was listening, not for sound, but for intention. In the polished surface of a dark television screen mounted on the wall, I caught my reflection again. This time, the delay was unmistakable. When I shifted my weight, the reflection followed a beat too late. When I raised my hand, it lingered at my side before mirroring the movement. The sight made my stomach drop. I stepped closer, watching as the reflection corrected itself slowly, reluctantly, as though pulled into alignment rather than moving willingly. A door at the far end of the lounge stood slightly ajar, light spilling out from the narrow gap. The hum seemed strongest there, the vibration tightening, focusing. I knew without being told that whatever explanation I wanted would be found beyond that door, and that opening it would mean staying longer than I intended. The thought of leaving surfaced suddenly and urgently, cutting through the haze that had settled over my thoughts. I turned back toward the entrance, half expecting the hallway to look different. It didn't, not overtly. But the distance felt longer, the lights spaced farther apart than before. The sense of pressure increased, the air growing dense enough that each step felt deliberate. I realized with a quiet jolt that the longer I stayed, the more the building encouraged movement deeper inside, and the less appealing the idea of leaving felt. The apartments were not empty because no one lived there. They were empty because whatever belonged to the place did not need to remain still. I forced myself to keep moving toward the entrance, counting my steps the way you do when you're trying to anchor yourself to something measurable. The hallway resisted in subtle ways, not by shifting or closing, but by stretching just enough to make progress feel uncertain. The hum followed me, never growing louder, never fading, maintaining a steady presence that felt less like sound and more like pressure. My reflection slid along the polished floor beneath me, lagging behind in a way that made my skin prickle, correcting itself only after I had already taken the next step. When the glass doors finally came into view, relief surged sharp and immediate. Cold daylight filtered through the snow outside, flattening the warm interior light and reminding me that the world beyond the building still existed. I quickened my pace, boots striking the floor louder now, the sound echoing down the corridor behind me. The apartments remained silent, their open doorways revealing the same untouched rooms, the same paused arrangements. Nothing tried to stop me. The patience remained, heavy and confident, as though the place did not doubt its ability to wait. I pushed through the doors and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me hard enough to steal my breath. The contrast was violent and grounding, the sharp bite of winter cutting through the warmth clinging to my skin. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, watching the snow fall with sound again, listening to the faint rush of wind moving through the trees. Behind me, the building hummed faintly, but the vibration did not follow me beyond the threshold. The door closed on its own with a soft click, sealing the sound inside. The parking lot looked unchanged at first glance. Snow covered the ground smoothly, my footprints leading back toward the car already softening at the edges. The looping tire tracks still circled the buildings, their pattern clear and deliberate, but now they felt distant, like evidence of something I had narrowly avoided rather than an invitation. I walked quickly, resisting the urge to look back at the windows, half expecting to see movement or faces watching from behind the glass. The lights remained steady and warm, offering nothing. The drive back to the highway felt shorter than it should have. The access road returned me to the interstate without resistance, the storm reclaiming its voice, as soon as I crossed whatever boundary the complex had occupied. Traffic was sparse but real, the presence of other vehicles anchoring me in familiar reality. My GPS flickered back to life without explanation, recalculating my route as if it had never failed. I did not slow down, I did not take another exit. The rest of the drive passed without incident, but the sense of unease settled into something quieter rather than fading entirely. It lingered in the background of my thoughts, surfacing in small, unexpected ways. I arrived home hours later, exhausted but alert, the city lights and familiar streets offering comfort that felt earned rather than assumed. I slept poorly that night, waking often with the impression of movement just beyond the reach of my vision. In the days that followed, I found myself noticing things I had never paid attention to before. Apartment buildings with every light on and no visible occupants. Parking lots swept clean after snowstorms despite the absence of cars. Windows that reflected my movement a fraction of a second too late when I passed them at night. Each time, the memory of that complex surfaced, along with the same quiet warning not to linger. The most unsettling moment came a week later, after a light snowfall. I stepped outside my apartment building early in the morning and stopped short. Tire tracks looped around the perimeter of the lot in long, overlapping arcs before leading away, their pattern eerily similar to the ones I had seen circling the complex. They did not correspond to any obvious maneuver. No one had parked or turned around there. The tracks simply circled, then left. I stood there longer than I should have, the cold seeping through my coat, telling myself winter driving produces strange marks all the time. I avoid unfamiliar apartment complexes now, especially ones that glow warmly at night without context. I don't step inside buildings that feel too prepared, too quiet, too ready for someone to arrive. I understand now that some places are not meant to be lived in. They are meant to observe, to study how people move when they believe they are alone, how long they hesitate before turning back. Somewhere along a forgotten stretch of highway, those apartments are still standing, lights on, rooms arranged, patient enough to know that winter will eventually send someone else looking for shelter, someone who will mistake warmth for safety, and believe that stepping inside is the same as finding a place to stay. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Before you drift back into the dark, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and which moment stayed with you the longest. Your whispers guide the night still waiting to unfold. Sleep well, if you can.